Forgiving God, your way is greater than human comprehension. Open our hearts and minds to truly understand your way of inclusion, that we may know the power of your grace and mercy modelled by your Son, and live as reflections of him. Amen. Hello, my name is David Van Oeveren and I am priest in charge of Greater Hastings and Archdeacon of Hawke's Bay Cities. This week we return to the Gospel of Mark and hear Jesus' second major speech. Jesus is first speaking to the Pharisees and some scribes. The audience changes to the crowds and then he speaks to his disciples. It is a terribly important passage around purity. Don't assume the Pharisees are antagonists of Jesus or are somehow works righteousness kinds of people or that they are villains in some way. There is a diversity of audience: Pharisees and scribes, crowds, disciples. So this issue is being directed to all, to everyone. You can't single out the Pharisees and the scribes or any one group. You are being addressed as well as one of Jesus' disciples. It is important for us to distinguish between tradition and commandment. Defility and impurity, uncleanliness, is not the same thing as sin or sinfulness, and this can trip us up. Jesus is reframing defilement. He is not showing disregard and contempt for the law. Defilement is putting your body into a state where it is not fit for encountering God. Jesus is talking about the way defilement is not as big of a deal as you thought it was. The power of life in Jesus is stronger than those things. However, the problem of evil in the world is not out there, it's inside you. Jesus is saying we can fight about purity ritual, but don't you realize there are much more serious things affecting the human person? In this COVID-19 time, and especially with the Delta variant, we must do all these things, and we must wash, and wash. However simple our faith, there are always plenty of outward signs of religion that might look holy and well-meaning. It's not our relationship with God, what goes on within our heart, that really matters. Remember the definition of sacrament: an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace. We are walking sacraments. What we do, how we behave, our words and actions and attitudes are to express something that's deep from within us, something that arises from our relationship with God. As we turn to James for this week, and for a few weeks to come, we hear, "Be doers of the word through love. You shall love your neighbour as yourself." The doing of the word, fulfilling of the law, the doing of good, is for the sake of loving your neighbour. What does it really mean to have faith? And what does that look like? Theology is a verb, not a noun. Theology is a doing action, not a naming, identifying. Often we find ourselves in a situation of far too much hooey and not enough doey, being hearers who forget rather than doers who act. Although James would suggest we need to work towards that perfect state that we see in the nature of God, where doing and being are never separated. James is exhorting us here to imitate God in knowing what we are like. Unlike God, we may need to change, but even this cannot be done if we do not really know ourselves in the first place. We are called to turning towards God and turning towards God's world. We hear these words: "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength, and your neighbour as yourself." It is in knowing ourselves, and only in knowing ourselves, that we can change and that we can love God and love our fellow human beings and turn towards God and God's world. We need to know ourselves and love ourselves. Otherwise, it will be like a fleeting glimpse in the mirror. Today is Anglican Communion Sunday, when we can reflect on who we are as a greater body. We are part of something bigger. We are part of a greater body. But how do you understand that? A sacrament is an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace. We are sacraments. What do we? How do we behave? What do we do? How do we behave? Our words and actions and attitudes are to express something that's from within us, something that arises from our relationship with God. We must be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger. Easier said than done, but if we are truly to reflect the glory of God as the Anglican Communion, that is what we must do. I invite you this week to reflect on what the Anglican Communion might mean for you. What does it really mean to have faith? And what does that look like? But for today, we are part of a greater body by being ourselves, worshipping with others from our congregation, church, local faith community, parish, archdeaconry, diocese and beyond. Be happy. Think positive. Be safe. Stay negative. Be kind to yourself and others, and thoroughly wash your hands. Amen.